that sounds okay. Did somebody take the little magnetic debris that was on the end of this? Okay, I think.
Oh, you need. I do have.
You have it?
Yes, I have
excellent. Way I don't have to worry about my computer going to sleep in the middle of my talk. Okay, it is a delight and an honor to be here, and it's been fascinating to listen to such a wide range of presentations today. I have discovered, oh, there's an odd thing. Oh, huh. I'm going to try this again just because I'm not getting my notes. Surprising to me. Oh, I know what it is. Okay, sorry. 1 second here. I've got to turn off display mirroring. I apologize for this. Anyway, I have discovered or noticed over the last couple of years, increasingly as I turn up at events like this. Oh, hold on, sorry, not that. What do I want to do? Arrangement, there we go. Tick, and that one. Okay, cool. Increasingly, as I have come to events of this sort over the last couple of years, I find myself, given the responsibility of this particular slot and sort of the closing remarks, which always presents two challenges. The first challenge, of course, is that one has to be in some way sort of synthetic about over series of presentations, often of quite different sorts that you have never heard before. And the other one is that I'm the person who stands between you and cocktails. Unusually in this, though, I can actually see the cocktails. So I also recognize that quite literally you're the people who stand between me and cocktails. So we'll see how that works out. And so I spoke with Christian the other day in preparation for this and talking a little bit about how the day would go and what contributions I might be able to make. And he pointed out, of course, that one of the reasons that they felt that my work might fit is exactly as Dietmar was just saying, in relation to some of the things I've written in the past about embodied interfaces and embodied interaction, particularly in where the action is. And that work got picked up and has been used by a number of people to motivate a certain kind of interest in alternative design materials, in alternative ways of thinking about interaction, human-computer interaction that engage different kinds of senses and different kinds of skills. However, it actually turns out that the book I've been working on while I'm on sabbatical and just trying to wrap up just now is actually about the materialities of information. So I'm going to try to speak more from that work, perhaps, than from some of the things that I've been engaged with in the past. Because where that previous work has been picked up with respect to questions of materiality, it has often been with respect to the kinds of materials from which computational artifacts can be built. But I sort of want to start in a different place today for thinking about materiality and indexicality. I want to think about the materialities of information in and of itself. And the point for this, perhaps, is the comments made by Donald Schoen, where he talks about design as a reflexive conversation with materials. And when we talk about a reflexive conversation with materials, the kind of thing that comes to mind is primarily this sort of image, the image of a sort of iconic conversation with materials through the hands and the clay here, the ways in which the clay resists the potter's will, speaks back about opportunities for action, and you get a sort of notion of a collective working towards a particular kind of artistic or design outcome. But my interest here was actually echoed a little bit by some of Tom's arguments earlier about the materials with which we grapple in developing digital systems. Because the question I've been asking myself for the last couple of years is, what is the material with which we are engaged in a reflexive conversation when we're doing digital design? I think both users of computer systems and most certainly the developers of computer systems have a strong understanding of the way in which those systems resist their will shape their will, that the way in which you have a conversation with technologies through which one discovers what it is that they might do for you and how it is they would like you to do it, or at least what kinds of constraints might appear or obstacles might appear in your path as you attempt to realize your goals. And so this is the kind of experience of the digital experience of data that I want to sort of think about here when I think about materiality. Now, those from a sort of HCI, human-computer interaction, or a cognitive science perspective, we're familiar with the ways in which some of these things might manifest themselves through studies of external cognition and distributed cognition. Most classically, perhaps, in this example of the difficulty of performing arithmetic operations outside of the Indo-Arabic numeral system. So if I ask you to multiply 2,631 by 732, you have, and we teach it to children, a rote procedure for doing that, a mechanical, mechanistic procedure for going through and doing those kinds of calculations that are than we can do in our heads. And yet when I present it in the form of Roman numerals, it becomes impossible. Without the positional system, there is no rote mechanical procedure by which we can perform and effect that calculation. And so it raises the idea of the intertwining of representation and practice. What we know how to do is, and what we're capable of doing is not simply computational here, but is mechanistic. These representations are also mechanisms by which things can be done. We find, and so this is the sort of idea of the constraints and opportunities afforded by different kinds of representations that sort of sparks my interest in digital representations. Paul Edwards, in his book A Vast Machine, where he sort of details some of the history, climate modeling, has this lovely example, which is not actually deeply germane to his argument, but which I find very telling. He tells the story of a point in the 1950s where the US National Weather Bureau had a data management, indeed a information overload problem. Their information overload problem was not simply that they had too much information, but that it was stored on punched cards, and they were afraid that their buildings could no longer support the weight of the data they had accumulated. My back-of-the-envelope calculation, which should be taken with a large pinch of salt, is that 1 gigabyte of data on punched cards weighs approximately 35 tons. And so next time you put your 16 gigabyte or 32 gigabyte flash drive, you might want to imagine what that would be if 1 gigabyte of data weighed 35 tons. Now, this is not simply a story about progress in the realm of the digital. I want to suggest that there's something much more significant about this. If your data weighs 35 tons, you don't search through it on the off chance that something is there. If your data weighs 35 tons, you don't randomly cluster it in order to see what it might tell you. You don't sort it just to find out if there's any particular kind of pattern. The nature of the representations here and their mechanical, mechanistic, and material properties deeply shape not just what we can do, but even what we can imagine doing with the data. And I kind of want to try and think about what that means in other kinds of digital spaces. How that mechanism, material, practice, process, and imagination are sort of are simultaneously present and entwined. So I'm going to tell you a couple of stories in different kind of spaces that are sort of examples that I've been sort of using to try to think through this stuff. The first story comes from, let's see, when would this have been? This would have been sort of in the early 1990s, early to mid 1990s, at a point where there were many fights going on in the digital networking community over network standards. And in particular, this story concerns the standardization of ATM, asynchronous transfer mode, which was once imagined as an alternative to TCP/IP as a sort of universal data transmission mechanism. Unlike TCP/IP, ATM was being standardized by the ITU, which is essentially part of the United Nations. And so the members of the ITU standardization committees are in fact themselves nations, not individual members. Each of whom have their own particular kind of interest in their own particular kinds of infrastructures. The fundamental problem about which I want to, the fight you about arose was over the size of cells, essentially packet sizes in ATM networking. So ATM, kind of like IP, breaks up data into little packets and squirts them down the wires at different rates. Now the question you have to ask yourself then when you have a design of this sort is how big should the packets be? They call them cells in ATM. How big should the cells be? If you have big cells, then the advantage is there's very little waste in the overhead of the housekeeping information that has to be at the top of every cell. You're like maximizing ratio of payload to overhead. But a big cell can take a long time to transmit, and so you can't you can't multiplex as many different kind of channels on a wire at the same time. So small cells might work better in that case, but then you have the overhead problems. This fight was going on in the ATM networking community. But in the end, actually, a slightly different problem arose. The problem that arose is when you transmit a signal down a wire, it tends to bounce off the end. It bounces off the terminating equipment. It creates an echo. You get a digital echo, an echo in the signal. And that echo can actually begin to interfere with the other data that's being transmitted. If you have a long packet, it's more likely to interfere with itself, and so you get more problems. Short packets can be transmitted before the echo even comes back. So it turned out in the end, though, that this turned into because of this problem of echoes, you also have to bear in mind that the signal spreads out in the wire. So a cell has a length when it's in the wire, right? It's being transmitted at a certain rate, so it spreads out in the wire, and it has a certain length. And this issue of the problems of echoes is to do with the length of the wires. So the fight about large cells and small cells turned into a fight between large countries and small countries. Large countries tend to have longer cables, longer transmission cables, and are less concerned about echoes in large packets because the packets are small with respect to the cables. Small countries, this is a much bigger problem. The reason I've got a map of France superimposed over New England here is because in the end, the fight came down to a consortium of countries led by the United States, big countries, and a consortium of countries led by France, small countries, fighting over essentially how long a packet was allowed to be with respect to the length of cables that they had installed that linking their major cities. So this is one level a story about the brutal materiality of digital information. We now have to be concerned with its length, we have to be concerned with its weight, we have to be concerned with what it looks like in a wire, we have to be concerned with how big it is with respect to our country and the distance between municipalities. But it's also importantly a story where technical, social, national, historical layers are all simultaneously present. You cannot solve this problem purely in the technological domain because it is not purely a technological problem. It's also an institutional problem, it's a historical problem, it's a geographical problem. These things are all true simultaneously. And so this representation, the digital network representation, the packet format, is indexical of considerably more than simply a series of technological choices. And indeed, as we sort of now look at the development of ATM networking, and I'll tell you the outcome of the story in a second, what we see it indexing and pointing back to is this sort of like all these different kinds of historical layers. The answer, by the way, to the problem, the small countries wanted a 32-byte cell, the large countries wanted a 64-byte cell. The eventual decision was to make it a 40-byte cell so that everybody was maximally inconvenienced, but nobody was favored. All right, so that's my first story. My second story, thinking about sort of materialities of the digital and materialities of information, comes from some ethnographic work that a number of I conducted at NASA. We were looking at the work of space science planning, in particular on the Cassini project, which has been flying a spacecraft around the Saturn system since about 2004. And we noticed many meetings organized that looked roughly like this, a bunch of people sitting around at digital data projected on the screen, but they weren't looking at PowerPoint slides, they were looking at Excel spreadsheets. The spreadsheet as an object that everybody had to look at, rather than the PowerPoint presentation, sort of intrigued us. And in particular, this is not a photograph that particularly inspired us, but one particular thing became really interesting here. So what was happening in the particular meeting we were looking at was that the scientists had to decide, they had made a plan for how much science they were going to do next time the spacecraft zoomed past one of the moons, Enceladus or whatever. But they now realized they didn't have quite enough fuel to make to do what they'd planned to do, so they now had less time available to them. And so they had to decide which of the things they had chosen they'd prioritize, or they had to reprioritize our science. Which pieces of the science could they now still gather, or which ones couldn't they gather? The goal was to have a spreadsheet, start off with a spreadsheet that had a list of all the things on it they wanted to do, and everything should be colored green for go or red for not. You know, we'll do the things that are green, we'll not do the things that are colored red. They come to the first of these. There's a long discussion, all sorts of debate, and eventually they go, you know what, let's just make that yellow for now, because we can't quite decide. It's sort of like, yeah, we'll maybe do it, maybe not, let's move on. Come to the second one, another big fight. Okay, this one should be kind of orangey. It's sort of like it's yellow, but it's a little more red, because it probably won't do it. And they go through, as you can imagine, right, at the end, there's a whole series. It's a multicolored, you know, eye-popping psychedelic screen with no green and no red on it at all, but lots of things that are sort of provisional. Now, I find this kind of interesting in a variety of ways. One reason I find this especially interesting is the opportunity that Excel offers you, where it what colors you've used before, and therefore allows you easily to reassign the same color as you've previously done. But also at the same time that one cannot sort by color in Excel. You can cluster by color, as it turns out. You can't sort. So it's actually really kind of intriguing here that the practice that had developed, and this is something that they were quite skilled in and had done many times in the past, was something that inherently meant that you could not order the results. You could know, you could debate, but you could not have the spreadsheet order them and then draw a line in the middle and say this far and no further. It pushed back out of the technical realm and into the realm of human deliberation, the process they were doing, so that there could never simply be a threshold that said this was it, it was going to be stop or go. We also found it really interesting the way that the spreadsheet would actually hold things into alignment but keep them separated. By using a spreadsheet with multiple columns, what they could do is express everybody's wants and desires, each group's wants and desires, in the same format, showing their relationship and their alignment, but never smooshing them too close together. Columns always live separately from each other, can be moved around independently, and so it was a way sort of maintaining, of demonstrating the alignment in interests between different kinds of otherwise warring groups, but at the same time not smooshing them together and erasing the individuality of any one particular group. So the particular kind of representational forms at work here, in this case the representational capacities of by a spreadsheet, were sort of entwined with a series of organizational decision-making processes that had developed in this particular group over the course of decades. They've been working for a long time. It takes a long time to build a spacecraft and get it to Saturn. So they've been at this for a long time, and they're very skilled at managing the problems of sort of dissent that occasionally arise. And what was remarkable was to watch how smoothly entwined this was with this particular kind of representational form. The representational form and the organizational decision-making processes were deeply entwined together. The last of the examples I want to sort of like just throw out here that sort of speaks a little bit to, or that I'm also sort of using, and which sort of like steps away from spreadsheets, but also thinks about data representation strongly, is inspired by an observation that Lev Manovich makes in The Language of New Media, where he suggests that the database is the primary cultural form of the 21st century, playing the role that the novel did in the 19th and that film did in the 20th. Not that everything is in a database, but that the database provides a certain kind of aesthetic, an aesthetic of relationality, a mechanism of relationality can also see in hypertext, in interactive fiction, in video games, and so forth, and that it's in much the same way that film gave us tropes of both visuality and montage, we can see similar kinds of things developing in 21st century media around the database. And I think there's a lot of power to the argument that Manovich offers, but he intentionally doesn't ever want to say anything about what the database actually is. He speaks to questions of relationality that speak in themselves to sort of relational database forms that we're become intimately familiar with. This is the primary database forms in most databases since the 1970s, that made sense perhaps when our computers looked like this. Which is actually a computer from a tax office in Great Britain, if anyone's interested, but perhaps works less well given recent transformations of computer architecture and hence of database technology. That is, that over the last couple of years, or last decade or so, we've seen a move from largely monolithic singular computer systems of this sort to highly distributed cluster computing of the sort sort of demonstrated here. That's what we associate with most sort of contemporary web services. That's what we associate with Google and so forth. And those architectures no longer support effectively the kind of database models that we've had in the past, and therefore the kinds of commitments to data integrity around which our applications have been designed. And so what we see is this sort of radical transformation at multiple levels of hardware systems, of database technologies, and of applications that are all sort of entwined together. There's a materiality of database representational form implied by the very idea of this kind of computer system as the computer that's going to process data. When we have this radically different kind of form, we also need to represent data in very different kinds of ways. I was thinking about this too during some of the presentations when we were thinking of the issues of, say, public sensing and public science, because this form also implies things about the ways in which data might be located, where we imagine it happens, what's the relationship between the locations of data and the locations of processing, how it is that sensor streams can be incorporated into and thought of as data forms themselves. And how it is that those things, again, are entwined with sort of locational practices of distributing data, with the structural aspects of database representations, and with the kinds of architectures by which they can be operated or through which they can be enacted. But my interest primarily here is not simply to talk about what I sometimes call the brute materiality of information infrastructures. That is, the question of where networks go and what kind of resources are consumed by data centers and what kinds of capacities different kinds of computational devices have. Those are important questions. Sorry, I had to put this slide up partly because of the Dietmar's example right at the beginning of the, illustrating Peircean semiotics by looking at the road. One of the things I particularly love, you can't really. So this, I should explain, this image was taken by my colleague Genevieve Bell somewhere in South Australia. I can't tell if the sign that internet access is in 1 kilometre is a warning or an informational sign. And you can't really see, and I don't think on this screen, but there's also crazy tire marks on the other side of the road, suggesting that somebody has interpreted it either as a warning or as information. I don't quite know, but anyway. My interest is not in this work so much with the brute materiality of information infrastructures. Rather, I want to think not so much about materiality, but specific materialities of informational forms. Their malleability, their fragility, their robustness, their transparency, the granularity with which they work, the revisability and reversibility that they offer, their dimensionalities, their heft, their length in wires that might be, in France or in the United States. These are properties by which we can begin to understand the variable materialities that information takes on. And indeed, if we start to think about, I wasn't planning to do this, so I'm want to go back to thinking about this, You know, it doesn't make sense for us to talk simply about the digital and the capacities of the digital or digital information when different kinds of materializations of that information have such radically different properties. So, sorry, as I say, I wasn't planning to do that. So it's in this sort of thinking about the multiple materialities and alternate materialities of digital information that I've been sort of, you know, thinking about the topics that we've been sort of broadly discussing today, you know, of the indexicality of information. I would sort of suggest, and the kinds of, and questions of traces, because I would sort of suggest that the important thing here is to say, you know, indices of what and traces of what, because the, digital information are not simply sort of records of human action, although they often are, but they also index infrastructural arrangements, social practices, professional skills, institutional relations, as we see in some of these cases of database forms and spreadsheet forms and network forms. And we need to be able to sort of see those there too. We need to be able to recognize the way that these things are indexical of multiple different things simultaneously, and that multiple indexicality is tremendously important. The multiple forms of simultaneous embeddedness are particularly important. So this is perhaps, I don't know, indexicality in the ethnomethodological sense. The other thing I sort of want to point to a little bit are sort of both histories and historiographies. That is, both the kinds of historical situatedness of data forms and informational forms, but also from the perspective of historiography, the way in which they shape what kinds of stories can be told and what kinds of narratives can be constructed in, around, through, and with digital forms. And so if we start to pay more attention to the constraints that different kinds of representation offer, then we recognize them too to be constraints in the kinds of ways that we can narrate our own experience, the experience of others, the sort of history of institutional arrangements and so forth, right? So the historiographical aspect, that is the particular kinds of stories we can tell, remains important as well. Finally, I sort of want to speak a little bit to the multiple temporalities, and I promise you that I put this on my slides before Florian raised it as a question earlier, which is this question of how these traces might point back not only to the past, but also point forward, not so much perhaps in ways in which data represents the future, but the ways in which particular kind of commitments to data forms shape and constrain future arrangements. These are the constraints, the foundations perhaps of tactics and improvisations of the sort that we were talking about in the last panel. Speak also to the possibilities of polyvocality and openness that that maybe sort of capture some of what Catherine is talking about with her sort of feminist visualization strategies. The openness is that we might have in future stories around data kind of depend in important ways upon these kinds of constraints. So while you know. While Kristen was sort of saying, well, you know, the work on embodied interaction might be really sort of useful here. I hate to disappoint you. But on the other hand, I do think questions about the material properties that information representations offer is perhaps an even stronger way to think about the relationships between indexicality, design, and experience. And with that, I'd suggest maybe since we're running out of time, maybe we should proceed to the back of the room for the rest of our discussions. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So I won't get in the way of that. Thank you very much. I do want to say I think we achieved our goal in terms of growing a variegated and inclusive community around this subject. I look forward to hearing from others about the conversations you have in the back of the auditorium going forward. But as you're back there, it's been a real feast, and there's another feast for your eyes terms of Florian Dombois' lithographs. Make sure you give them some careful attention. And then we also have a thank you for Dietmar again and all the speakers, all the panel members. And I would also mention we will have some music, improvisational music accompanying your enjoyment of the rest of the evening. So thank you all very much for coming, and we hope we can gather again at another time with different perspectives and new knowledge about this subject. Thank you. Okay. We have a request here for the panelist speakers to gather here for a group portrait. It's one of those things where 50, 70 years from now, someone will be trying to figure out who everyone is. But if you would, if the speakers and panelists would